Greetings, everyone. We're going to get started. So we've now arrived. You've had the chance to unpack the plenary in a cohort or in a context of your choice. Now we're going to get to work. So roll up those sleeves and get ready to engage in an implementation workshop, we're calling them. So throughout the planning of this conference, we've been thinking a lot about what do we really mean by the phrase the science of learning. And you heard Erin speak to that at a fairly general level. We'd like to have you pull out of your registration folders the chart that she briefly referenced. This is going to be key for our session today. So it's this horizontally oriented sheet. The game plan for our session today is to let you think about a problem of practice, a challenge that you're facing in the teaching you're doing directly or in the teaching being done and the learning being done by the courses and faculty that you support. After you think about that challenge momentarily, we're going to ask you to identify one of a subset of 5 principles that we've chosen to then think more about and to make some plans. So indeed, in the spirit of it being a workshop, there will be a lot of time for you to be fleshing out trajectories that will be useful in your own context. And then at the end, we'll share back out to the larger group. To get us started, though, let's take a minute to look at the sheet itself, since we didn't have a lot of time for that in the opening. And think about these 9 principles that are roughly bucketed into cognitive, behavioral, and affective, with 2 as bookends. Thinking about aiming, by which we engage what Steve Cosson was talking about, and being really clear about what is it that we want our students to know and do as a result of the learning experience. Detect and scaffold, be building on what it is that students already know in ways that sequence for them. To model, activate, and guide, and you can see throughout to the right in the columns some more concrete ways to enact these kinds of principles. On the affective dimensions, to connect and to have high expectations, and then to make sense of it all in assessing. What we've done is put together examples, concrete manifestations or practices that build on and expand beyond what's in the rightmost column. So you'll see here a couple of examples to help you visualize, well, what do we really mean by activate? What could that look like in my classroom? You'll be given the chance to look at more such examples and think of additional ones for your own, and as I said, make a plan for your context. Because we knew that we wouldn't be able to do justice to all 9 principles, we decided that we would focus us all today on these 5. So again, in a moment, you'll be given the chance to think about a problem of practice and to then connect with one of these. I want to say, now that you have the big picture, I want to say a special thank you and introduction to my wonderful colleagues. Adrienne Phelps-Coco, who's at the Division of Continuing Education, and Josh Bookin, who's at the Graduate School of Education. When I decided that I wanted to have this be one of our implementation workshops, I picked up the bat phone and called my fantastic colleagues who I knew would be incredibly expert and skilled and lovely to work with, and that's been absolutely the case. So thanks to you both for what we're about to experience together today. Any questions about what we're up to here? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Adrienne.
Hello, welcome everybody. So what we want to do is make sure, as we think about the science of learning, that it fits in with your course and with the practices that you're doing and with the challenges that you're facing. We're hoping that this session can help you come up with some solutions to actual challenges that you have, or if you are someone who works with faculty in designing their courses, to actual challenges that you often hear people encounter. So what we want to do today is we're going to walk you through a series of steps to think about some of those challenges and then to brainstorm some solutions with your colleagues. So to get started, there is in the center of your table, there is a worksheet that has a paper clip. Not the thing that's in the envelope, the thing that's sitting open on the table with the paper clip. The envelope will come in a minute. So if you can distribute those amongst yourselves, that'll be our step one here.
Is this a worksheet? Yes.
Yes. All right, everybody got it? So what we want to do is start with the very first step where we want to think about a problem of practice. And what we mean by that is either a challenge that you know you're facing or something that crops up in your evaluations, you're not quite sure what to make of it. Or again, if you're working with faculty, something that you hear from people that you would like to have some solutions for. So we want you to take about 5 minutes and just write about this challenge for yourself. If you finish early, you can talk with the person next to you. But let's define the problem, then we'll start getting into solutions. So you can probably guess what we're about to do next, which is our goal here is really to think about how we can use the science of learning to make improvements to your course or the courses you're working with these challenges. So what we want you to do is sort of read over those categories just a little bit again and see if you get a sense of which of these might be most helpful for solving your challenge. And then what we're going to do is we're all going to stand up and move to tables so you can discuss your challenges. But take just a second, look over these principles. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask for a show of hands for who is interested in which principle. And that way we're going to divide up the tables in a way that, if half of you want to talk about detect, we'll make a lot of detect tables. And if only a few of you want to talk about activate, we'll just make one. Sound good? All right. We got maybe two. All right, that's good. Good to know. So while they're figuring out the tables here, I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. Is once we have the tables, we'll put all the numbers up. You can go to the table for the principle you're interested in. And then there is a packet at the middle of the table. And inside that packet, you're going to find a whole lot more information about each of these principles, including examples that are being used here at Harvard and elsewhere, and also just a little bit more examples of how you might put these into practice. And what we're going to ask you to do is spend some time reading over the part of your packet that applies to your table. So we gave you all the whole packet, so you can come away with the whole thing. But if you're in Activate, you can skip straight to the Activate. And to think about those ideas and then to think about how you might adapt them for your own classroom practice. And then we're going to do some group share out and some collective note taking so that we can come away with as many ideas as we possibly can. Does that sound good to everybody? All right, anybody have any questions about any of these up to this point? All right, everyone. So as you get settled, so what many of you are already doing is please introduce yourself to the other people at the table. If you have a lot of people at your table, you may want to split into 2 groups so you have smaller groups talking to each other. But just do a quick introduction, tell people why you're here, what your problem of practice is. We're only going to spend about 5 minutes on this, so let's make it more of a lightning round. But take a minute to introduce yourselves. All right, everyone. It looks like intros are winding down at some of the tables, so I want to tell you what's going next. You still need a few more intros, that's fine. Now's the time to open up that packet if you have not and find your principle. And we want you to spend the next 8 minutes or so thinking about reading through the ideas for your principle and then looking at parts C and D on your worksheet. Which is really thinking about, as you read the examples of the handout, do any of them seem like they're going to work for your context, or might they work if you adapted them? And then also, are there any other practices that you're already doing or that learning about those principles make you think of? that could then be useful. So you're going to spend about 8 minutes doing some writing, thinking on your own. If you need to finish intros first, that's totally fun. All right, everybody. It seems like the conversation has picked back up again, which is a good thing. So even if you're not completely done with your writing, you can always go back to that later on. But what we want to do here is, you'll see in this packet, we have given you some examples that we have gathered of either examples from Harvard or from elsewhere that we really think are thought-provoking and can help everyone improve their teaching. But what we'd really like to do is expand on that. So for the next 15 minutes, what we want you to do is share with each other any ideas that you came up with, or collectively work on some ideas. And we have a series of Google Docs for each of these principles. So these are the URLs for each of the Google Docs. And we're going to ask one person from each group to be the note taker. And we will share all of this out later on. But our goal here is to really expand on what you've got in this packet and create a greater bank of ideas that everyone can draw from. Sound good? So
or even to just talk about how you might use one of the things that's in the packet in your own context.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be a huge leap. 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for engaging deeply with the material and with each other. I sat in on a variety of conversations and found rich problems of practice that people were workshopping in really interesting ways. What we'd like to do now is to get a little bit of a snippet of what happened at the various tables and with the various principles. This is not going to be the only time that you're going to be able to interact with other people's topics. So there's the Google Docs that people are taking notes in, and some groups are taking notes by hand. Feel free to continue to do that throughout the remainder of the session. We'll collect those and we'll send those links out to everyone. The rest of the packet, obviously, with the other 4 principles that you probably haven't had a chance to read yet, hopefully are good resources, and will also be available at the end to chat. But what we're doing now is we have 3 minutes, pretty quick share outs per principle, and so I will try to keep us to that. But we'd love to hear interesting ideas, unresolved issues, or insights that your group came up with. So we'll start with AIM. So these first 2 tables. So if anyone wants to volunteer.
All right, hi everybody, my name is Jeremy. I had the pleasure of working with Yasha, Ramona, and Laura on AIM. We did not resolve all of the issues with regard to linking our teaching goals to learners' learning objectives. We did sort of unanimously decide, or come to a consensus, that being very explicit, being very upfront about what our specific teaching goals were early in a teaching encounter or in a curriculum, and then doing some sort of detection or assessment to determine how those goals align with learners' objectives is important, particularly in this contemporary era in which we are judged by student evaluations and their perceptions of the utility of the courses and content that we develop. Along those lines, we struggled with the challenge of the sort of one-room schoolhouse model, where we may have learners with different levels of knowledge, with different perspectives, with different agendas coming into a teaching encounter or into a course or curriculum. And we did not fully address how to tackle that challenge. Similarly, we struggled with the idea of developing goals and learning objectives that are more content or factual based, and maybe less about analysis and application and higher level skills, and how to build those in a way that can be meaningful for the learners and that can be assessed in a meaningful way down the road.
I don't think so. That was excellent.
Nicely done, and a great model. Anything that this group would like to add about sort of AIM? Ideas can be specific things people wanted to try, or general principles.
Sure. So I'm Holly from the second AIM table, and I'll just read a couple from our group. We have a number of people who support faculty in the creating of learning objectives and assessment of learning, and so we had some really interesting conversations about how to do that, because faculty will often think that everything they're teaching is critical. So how do you help them to identify the enduring understandings? And sometimes having an outside perspective, either from an educational specialist or convening a group of alums from a course that are 5 years out that you might actually run into an airport, are two practical ways that we talked about to try to crystallize those enduring understandings. We were all really taken by that part of the AIM idea. We talked about posting learning objectives in the physical classroom environment and or in some electronic way checking in with students every 1 to 2 weeks to say like how far along are we progressing. That's getting a little bit into some of the more assessing things, but just making sure that you're continuously revisiting the learning objectives as opposed to writing them and putting them aside, or putting them on your first slide and putting them aside.
Wonderful. One thing I'm struck by about AIM is how ambitious sort of the airport goal is, and that less can often be more of, this idea of everything seems important, but then nothing gets sort of the treatment that it deserves. And I think these schematics are very interesting to think about, sort of how much are we trying to do and how much they relate to each other. So even if we don't give them to students, how do we ourselves understand how these things all fit together? Great, thank you. So what's next? Yeah, next table for detect.
Hi, I'm Margaret, and our group talked about the detect principle, finding appropriate ways to gauge what your students know and don't know. And our group had people who play a number of different roles in a number of different schools, so that was really great, and I'm hoping that my peers will speak in if I forget anything, because I was busily taking notes. One theme that came up with our group is the importance of building trust in your community and making sure that the students know that it's okay to ask questions. And also we discussed how it's great to empower the students to decide themselves how are we going to build a community, and that will help with the detect. Another topic that we talked about was the power of small group discussions and presentations, and how that peer effect can be motivating to help students prepare and do the reading or whatever work is needed before class. And if they don't do the work or reading, that one, they need to be able to own it and acknowledge it when they're doing small group work, and secondly, that they may be motivated to do that work because they know that their peers are depending on them to contribute to that small group work. We also talked about cases in which students need to self-evaluate their own work. And it was related that students are often very highly critical of themselves, and maybe one of that, this is in the case of speaking, that the students may be self-critical because they don't realize the huge amount of effort that goes into preparing presentations or speeches, and it would be great to be transparent about that so that they know how much time it takes, and then would have a better gauge about how to self-evaluate where they are currently in their skills and how they can improve. We also talked about the new course schedules and what do you do if you have a 3-hour stretch of time to cover things. I'm not sure we solved that problem, but if anyone has any ideas, please go to the Google Doc. And finally, we also touched on the in-class polling. What do you do if the faculty with whom you work are not really on board on using that? What are some possible other ways to address that? And we didn't really solve that challenge quite either, but again, please go to the Google Doc and write your ideas.
Great, thank you. And the other group from Detect, things to add, or was that the one? That was one group. Okay, so I think one thing I'll say about Detect, that a middle point you made about sort of metacognition or self-assessment, I think that is very powerful as a modality, and the learning sciences says that as well. And I like how you also talk about, in some ways, modeling for them that metacognition and giving them a sense of how hard it is to do a public speech and sort of what are the component parts before they then overly critically assess themselves against sort of unfair metrics. So activate. Who from this table? Anyone want to share some thoughts or willing to?
So ours is going to be really broad. Basically, we each had struggles that other schools had conquered. So I think just our takeaway for this is to look and see what other schools are doing. So for example, my challenge was looking at large lectures at 8 a.m. for working adults, and they're taped, so students don't come. What do you do? And this is what spurred the medical school's curriculum reform. Business schools looking at how to bring more voices into their case discussions, and it's something that the Kennedy School is looking at with Teachly. So we just found that if we're looking around at other schools, people are doing things and having the same challenges that we were having and solving them. So.
Great, thank you. Table 6, thoughts to add in terms of Activate?
Well, we talked about one particular problem, probably mostly, was dealing with consultancy. A problem where we have a classroom of doctors and nurses learning to teach, and some of the problems that come up in terms of hierarchies, getting people to work together and not clump together, and talked mostly about consultancies and how those might be in kind of what we're doing here, in fact, and how that might help them solve some of those problems. I don't know if you want to add anything. I also discovered that the problem that I had written down would probably better address stepping back a little bit and really aim, which is also a good thing to realize, right?
That's great, yeah.
Are you going to say what your problem was or what your challenge was?
It was mostly dealing with a faculty member who was ambitious and not being able to rein in some of the excitedness of his plans, and just having that person then go on and do other things, kind of just not feeling very useful in that moment, and trying to come up with a solution when maybe it really should have started in a negotiation back at that level. So.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and then the last table on Activate.
Okay, so we had a lot of different ideas as we were talking about different challenges, but one of the, I think, themes that we talked about was creating self-driven activities or expectations or norms on the part of the people learning in our different situations, where they're actually setting their own goals or working towards that, and then we just help them negotiate that with each other. We were also talking about finding opportunities for more collaborative activities where they can learn from each other rather than having us stand in as an instructor, really finding opportunities for them to practice their learning through showing. And we also talked about finding opportunities for those students to frame content or create the content that they want to learn. And if that doesn't work, finding opportunities for them to reflect or personalize their approach to the content in a way that's useful and applicable to them so that they know what they're taking away while they're actually in the learning situation.
Great, thank you. One of the things I hear coming through that theme that your table was talking about is motivation and self-efficacy. And another thing that, in terms of peer instruction and learning from each other, I was struck that one of the most dramatic findings of the research literature is that when students are teaching each other, the person doing the teaching tends to learn more than the student getting instructed. So I had always assumed it would be the other way around. So it could be very powerful in all directions. Great. So the Connect table.
So we talked about the challenge of connecting, and we had some really interesting examples, particularly in online or very large courses, or folks who are doing part-time learning where you can never gauge who's in the room or why they're there. So we had a lot of discussions about different techniques to try, and something interesting is to make them feel a connection to you as the instructor, which is a kind of strange thing, maybe in an online setting, to feel like you can take the time to try to get the students to know you and to understand that you're not there just to make this difficult for them, but that you are motivated to help them. So we talked about that. We talked about some challenges in connecting in courses that are actually really hard because sometimes they'll think that you're just in it to embarrass them or give them a terrible grade or something. And we talked about the importance of sort of setting that vision up front, even taking the time, especially in the beginning, to make that connection to their bigger picture. Why are they there? This is going to be a long journey, but go on it with me, and then trying to reiterate that message a few times throughout the semester. And then a great tip at the very end of the semester, once hopefully they've done that journey with you, to ask if they could offer words of advice or wisdom. What did they wish they knew at the beginning of the course, and then having that available in your pocket for when you teach it the next time, because then it's coming from other students, not from scary you. And then we just talked in general about the concept of fostering participation and engagement, which we felt is really important to connection. And again, that's establishing what I know in the business school we call a learning contract up front, just letting them know that what you expect, preparation being very essential, as is participation, and that the more that they do that, the more they'll get out of it, and trying as best you can to create a safe environment, just to make sure that people feel comfortable speaking up. So that's what we talked about.
Great. I love one of the many ideas you said in there is the idea of connecting even between classes of different years. So there's connections that can go in so many different directions, but even that longitudinal institutional knowledge, that's a great idea. So the last principle, assess, and this is assessing our own teaching, not assessing the student's learning. But so anyone who'd be comfortable sharing out?
I don't know that we did such a good job tackling the assessment, because we ended up touching on all these other issues too, but all because of the challenges of figuring out how to assess. And so we didn't come up with solutions. We had a couple of ideas, which were having in-class polling that can be showing live, so you get a sense of basically, is this working, and identifying problems before moving on past them. We talked about not being too adherent to student evaluations, but going back to the aims, which is like this all kind of comes full circle, but going back to the aims and thinking, how could we figure out 5 years out whether they know it or not, and is there a way that we can implement that to reach out to people and find out what they know? And then finally, we talked about the value of small groups within the class with guided questions as a way of, you can figure out what they knew coming in, and they can teach each other within that small group, and it also empowers them to speak up within the class. So I think those are the main things that we covered, right? Yeah, but what we all agreed on is that there is not a good way to assess, as far as we can tell right now. And you guys have other thoughts, so it would be really helpful to everyone.
That's great. Let's see, in terms of other thoughts on assess, I mean, I'm struck by the last point you made of sort of, if we're trying to assess the efficacy of our teaching, assessing our students' learning, if you actually get them in groups and see, can they do the tasks that we're asking them to do, that is really good real-time feedback, in addition to a polling of, does this make sense to you, or actually, can you do this question? But I mean, one thing I've seen, and I'll circle back to this and see if my colleagues have other thoughts, but I'm hearing in a really good, productive way the difficulty of isolating these principles from each other. In the same way, one of the things that I have found most powerful for me as I think about how to tackle teaching problems is the idea of having a pedagogical repertoire and then matching it to the right situation. And in this case, we're almost meta here. It's sort of, we have a teaching problem of practice, and we're trying to figure out what principle can be sort of the entry point or sort of the main lever for change. But they're all interconnected. And so when we hear about people starting with or being inactivated and realizing they want to go back towards aim, or people who are doing things about detect and seeing that trust and connecting is a really important way to be able to detect, because people aren't going to give you the data that you need if they don't feel comfortable. And so I feel like my last thought on the assess question that you opened up was, it is a thing to start from the beginning as a culture in the classroom of, I myself am very open to learning from you and making changes. So it's the in-class polling, it's the 1-minute papers at the end of the first class session, it's the mid-semester feedback, it's reporting it back to them, and then showing that you're doing those changes, such that, because I often read course evals and help faculty members digest them, and it's not surprising but notable to me how many times students say, this was an issue, the faculty got data from us and really addressed it, and I deeply appreciate that, and we saw how it changed over the trajectory of the experience. So that sort of building assessment in on a daily basis has, to me, been really powerful. I don't know if you have anything to add on that before we transition.
I think if I can just add one thing. So I've been using anonymous feedback surveys built into Canvas, which are basically a variation on the minute paper. And I've been doing it for 4 years now, I think, and I will never teach without it again. Because you learn so much. You think you can assess how people are doing by looking them in the eye. But when you actually ask them, you learn things like, oh, this activity didn't go well because it was too hard, or because all of my kids have the flu and it was just a hard week. You get all of this information from people that you wouldn't otherwise get just by asking, and it's wonderful. So I highly, highly recommend it. Yeah.
So we tried that last year, and what we found was that all we did was invite the angry people to anonymously tear us apart.
And then people started skipping it. And I actually ended up having students come up after and say, I'm not one of them. I'm on your side. And so we decided not to do it this year. So, I think that it can go both ways.
It can. I make them worth 1 point every week. I mean, that's silly, but it does get people to do it. And I report back on it every single week. So I say, this many people, half the group thought this activity was fantastic. The other half did not.
That's actually a really good
and that reporting lets them see that there are lots of sides to every issue, so that if an activity wasn't great for them.
You obviously don't make people's angries.
We have a response here.
Another thing that we do to get around this, like just hearing the complaints issue, is that we have them as plus deltas, which I think is in one of these as well. And so they have to say one thing that they want to see more of because it's going well for them, and one thing they want to change, which can come still across as a complaint, but also it can come as a more productive, constructive thought.
Great. Wow. So we are, let's see. Am I on? Yes, I'm on. Okay. We're close to the end of our time together. I'd like you to think about the problem of practice that you wrote about when we started. Think about what it is that you've learned in discussion with others today, in reading the handouts, in hearing from other groups. And the last prompt on the worksheet is just to think, what is one thing you are going to try out or do differently, or even think more about as a result of this conversation. So take a moment and jot that down, and we'll hear from a few of you about your own trajectory during this session. All right. Sorry, thank you. So, a couple of takeaways that we hope you leave with. The first is the generosity and richness of the contributions that you've made with each other to the Google Docs and in the report outs. There's only so much that can happen in a 75-minute chunk of time, but a lot has happened. We want to continue to use the Google Docs as a repository for great ideas. So if you took notes and didn't use the Google Doc, please leave your sheet and we'll upload it. I also was struck in the plenary by Steve Kostelin's comment about the distinction between knowing the skill or the content and knowing when and how to use it. And I think we've seen both the potential for transfer across contexts of some of these practices, and also some of the challenges for that. At the bottom of the handout, you've seen we've listed additional resources. Some of these are the places where we ourselves generated or found these exercises. So we encourage you to check these out as well. What are a couple of takeaways, or I plan to do this differently or better as a result of the session that you wrote about? What's something that... Yes, Casey.
I think I'm going to try at the end of Unit 1 doing a plus delta just on an index card. So asking students, so we're a third of the way through the semester now, what do you want to see more of?
and what suggestions you have for things you might want to change.
Great. And that's in an online context.
So I think I'm actually going to do it in class on an index card and ask them to drop it into a box as they walk out the door.
Great. Okay. Other?
I think we might find ways to reincorporate the surveys, because I like the idea of reporting back to them, so because I think that our problem was that they didn't take it seriously. And so I think that really showing them that we're listening to them, I think that that's incredibly helpful.
Great. Other things? Virginia, what are you going to do differently?
Mine was the same, actually. Well, I was going to use the anonymous feedback each week on Canvas.
Okay.
That's great. Because I think it's also a way to report back and help shape their expectations. Keep them realistic. And mine as well.
I think just using the map of the general understanding, the airport concepts, what we want them to learn, and then what do we want them to remember, both in terms of when I work with faculty and thinking about the course overall or the session, but also in terms of my own work. I spend a lot of time developing cases and using that construct to help me think about the case material and how I'm going to put it together.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, in trying to walk our own talk, you'll be receiving, for the conference overall, a quick survey, and there will be a space for you to share feedback about this session. Because this was a new experience for us, and we plan to repurpose it in different ways. We'd love to hear what worked and what didn't for you, and we look forward to continuing to be in touch virtually and in person. So thank you very much.